Okay, so we're diving into the world of dance today, and we've got a really unique story to unpack.
Yeah, this is fascinating. We're going to be looking at a dancer named Charlene who's making her way in the New York City dance scene.
And we're drawing from some really insightful excerpts from a conversation she had on the Try Girl podcast. It's originally from Shu, actually.
Right, and what makes this deep dive particularly interesting is that Charlene's path is anything but linear.
Exactly. She didn't just, start ballet at 5 and never look back.
Not at all. Her journey takes us from early training in Chinese dance, both folk and classical, all the way through K-pop, and then deep into various street dance styles.
It's a real mix of genres, which
Hmm.
is honestly more representative of how many dancers develop these days, right?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
The lines between styles are definitely becoming more blurred. But Charlene's story really highlights the core elements of dance education, finding your style, overcoming challenges, and just dealing with the reality of what it means to pursue dance at any level.
Totally. And I think there are a lot of valuable lessons here for anyone who's passionate about learning and growth, even outside of dance.
Absolutely. So to kick things off, Charlene started dancing really young, like 3 years old. That's incredible.
Wow, 3 years old. And as you mentioned, it was Chinese dance.
Yes, and it's fascinating to think about how those early forms of dance can shape a dancer's body awareness and movement quality. It's like their first dance language in a way.
Which can have both pros and cons, I imagine, as they branch out into different genres later on.
Definitely. But for Charlene, that early chapter in Chinese dance wasn't a straight line.
No, not at all. And this part is kind of surprising. Her teacher actually suggested she stop. The teacher felt her physical attributes weren't quite right for it and encouraged her to focus more on academics.
It's amazing how a single experience or comment can sometimes derail someone, even temporarily.
It makes you think about all the potential talent that might get overlooked or discouraged early on.
Oh, absolutely. It happens in every field, but I think it's particularly relevant in the arts, where subjective opinions can have such a big impact.
But the key takeaway here is that passion often finds a way to resurface. And for Charlene, that reignition came through K-pop.
You know, it's so interesting how popular culture can spark those kinds of personal journeys. K-pop, with its high-energy choreography and visual storytelling, has captivated a global audience, and for many, it becomes a gateway into dance.
Totally. And she specifically mentioned EXO's Shao as that initial spark. It got her hooked. So how did she go about actually learning those dances?
Well, this is where her self-motivation really shines. She's completely self-taught, relying on online videos to learn the choreography.
Wow, that takes a lot of dedication and discipline.
It really does. It speaks volumes about her inherent drive and passion for dance. I mean, to break down intricate choreography from videos alone requires a keen eye for detail and a ton of patience.
It also highlights this accessibility to learning that we have today. You can literally learn almost anything online, from coding to dance.
Exactly. But let's fast forward a bit. Charlene moves to the U.S., settles in California, and joins her high school dance team in San Diego.
And I'm curious, when you think high school dance team, you probably have a certain image in your head. But this team wasn't exactly what you might expect.
Right. Charlene described it as more of a cheerleading style of dance, so less of the bounce that we often associate with street dance, and more focus on things like tumbling and sharp, synchronized movements.
Interesting. So even within the broader category of dance, there are these distinct subcultures with their own vocabularies and priorities.
Absolutely. And we'll see how these early exposures to diverse styles play a role in Charlene's development later on. But there's another interesting detail here. She also briefly dabbled in something called A-pop.
A-pop, what's that?
She described it as a form of aerobics-based dance, so very high energy, focused on fitness. It just goes to show her willingness to try different things, even if they're outside her main area of interest.
Which is great. But I think the next really pivotal chapter in her dance journey happened during a pretty unique and challenging time, the pandemic lockdown in Shanghai.
Talk about making the most of an unexpected situation. While many of us were, baking bread and binge-watching TV, Charlene used that period of isolation to seriously dive into street dance.
It's kind of amazing how constraints can sometimes breed creativity and focus.
Totally. And she specifically mentioned styles like Banzi and ISO. For those who aren't familiar, Banzi is known for its fluid movements and strong musicality, and ISO, short for isolation, is all about controlling individual body parts with incredible precision. It's super impressive to watch.
So, confined to her home, she basically created her own intensive dance program. And get this, she was taking online choreography classes late at night because of the time difference with the US, where she had other online commitments.
Talk about dedication. It's like she flipped her schedule and turned her days into a full-time dance intensive.
Exactly. And she's not exaggerating about the intensive part. She mentioned taking up to 7 classes a day. That's wild.
It just shows you what's possible when passion and opportunity align, even in unexpected circumstances. It's a testament to her commitment to pushing her boundaries.
This whole experience really raises a fundamental question about learning any skill, not just dance, the value of formal training versus self-teaching. And Charlene actually reflected on this in the interview.
Right. She acknowledged that trying to grasp those core foundational elements of dance solely through self-teaching can be really difficult.
Because there are so many nuances that you might not even realize you're missing.
Exactly. She talked about the challenge of truly understanding how movements originate in the body and where the power and momentum are generated without the guidance of a teacher.
Like weight transfer, for example. It's such a fundamental concept in dance, and it's probably so much easier to grasp when a teacher can physically demonstrate it and explain those subtle adjustments.
She also pointed out that while you can, of course, learn choreography by painstakingly breaking down videos focusing on things like foot placement and heel movements, understanding the concept of Zhang, which translates to center of gravity, makes a huge difference. And that's something a teacher would typically emphasize and explain.
It's like the difference between memorizing steps and truly embodying the movement.
Yes, exactly. And that deeper understanding can make learning so much more efficient and effective. But here's where it gets really interesting. Even with all this self-directed learning in online classes, Charlene still felt like the overall system of dance was somewhat fragmented for her.
So what does she mean by that?
Well, she contrasted it with the more linear, hierarchical understanding you might develop in a subject like science or math. In those fields, concepts often build very logically upon each other. But dance can feel more like a puzzle where you're collecting pieces from different places without always knowing how they fit together.
That makes sense. It's almost like you're learning different dialects of a language without really grasping the underlying grammar.
Exactly. And she gave a great example. She said that learning about texture in dance, those subtle qualities that give movement character, often comes from seemingly insignificant details that teachers might mention in passing.
Like a certain way to angle your wrist or tilt your head, those little things can make a big difference.
Absolutely. And she emphasized the importance of observation, noticing those subtle variations in how different dancers execute the same steps. That's where you start to pick up on the nuances of style and personal expression.
Which also brings up the challenge that even experienced teachers sometimes have in articulating exactly how certain movements are done.
Right. So much of dance knowledge becomes embodied. It's muscle memory and personal style, and that's not always easy to translate into words.
So true. It's like trying to explain how to ride a bike. You just have to feel it.
Right. Okay, so they then went on to discuss body awareness and supplementary training.
Which is something a lot of dancers, especially those who are mostly self-taught, might overlook.
Definitely. And Charlene agreed that foundational exercises are crucial for building strength and muscle memory. But she made this really insightful point.
About
The potential disconnect between intellectually knowing where a muscle is and actually engaging it correctly while you're dancing.
Oh, I can see that. It's one thing to point to your bicep on an anatomy chart, but it's another thing to consciously activate it while you're doing a complex arm movement.
And she had this great example about students who were trying to do chest waves but were initiating the movement from their shoulders instead of their chest muscles.
Oof, I can imagine that wouldn't feel very good.
Probably not. And she talked about how a teacher can use physical cues and hands-on adjustments to bring that awareness into focus.
So the student can actually feel the correct muscle engagement. That makes so much sense.
She even mentioned a teacher in Shanghai who would physically point to the specific back muscles that needed to be engaged for certain movements. It's that direct, tactile feedback that can really make a difference.
Totally. It's like turning on a light switch in your body. Now, this leads us to something that I think a lot of people struggle with, not just in dance, but in any skill: addressing incorrect habits.
Yes, and Charlene emphasized how difficult it can be to even recognize those ingrained bad habits without external feedback.
Because they just feel normal to you. You don't even realize you're doing something inefficiently or incorrectly.
Right, and she used this really helpful analogy: initiating shoulder movements by leading with the elbow.
So the movement might look sort of right, But it's not the most effective or aesthetically pleasing way to do it.
Exactly. It limits the full potential of the movement, and this is where technical classes really shine.
Because they break down the mechanics of each movement.
Exactly. Charlene stressed that these classes are essential for building proper technique, which often gets less emphasis in choreography-focused classes.
Makes sense. In those classes, the goal is to learn the steps, not necessarily master the underlying technique.
Right. And she even recommended seeking out foundation classes within specific styles, like K-pop foundation classes, that focus on things like bounce and rock.
Oh, that's a good tip. It's like reinforcing the building blocks before you start building the house.
Exactly. Now, there's this interesting concept in street dance called foundation or fangdantian that Charlene initially underestimated.
Fanganchen.
Yeah, it's basically the foundational movements, the grooves, the isolations that underpin more complex choreography and freestyle. And she initially thought it wasn't that important, especially in classes where the focus was on learning choreo.
Because she already had that base from her previous training.
Right. But her perspective changed when she started exploring freestyle more seriously. She realized that foundation is crucial because it gives you a base to work from when you're improvising.
It's like your movement vocabulary. The more you have, the more expressive you can be.
And she pointed out that those seemingly simple foundational elements, bounce, groove, isolation, can actually reveal a lot about a dancer's understanding and control.
Because it's in those fundamental movements that you can really see someone's mastery.
Exactly. Even within something like the bounce, there's so many variations and nuances. Charlene talked about how you can initiate the bounce from the heel or the entire leg, and how different dancers engage their whole body in those foundational movements. It's really fascinating.
It's a good reminder that mastering the basics is never a waste of time. They're the foundation for everything else.
Absolutely. Okay, so given Charlene's background in Chinese dance, I'm curious about how that influenced her approach to street dance, which feels, stylistically very different.
And she actually addressed that, right? She said there were some significant differences in the overall feeling and orientation of the body.
Right. She noted that Chinese dance tends to be more upright and elongated, whereas hip-hop and many street dance styles have a more grounded downward energy.
So it's almost like you have to relearn how to hold and move your body.
Totally. But she did find a potential connection in the area of breath and rhythm, referencing the concept of qi-ku.
What is kiku?
In Chinese dance, it refers to the coordination of breath and movement to create a dynamic flow. And it made me think about how seemingly different dance forms can actually share some underlying principles.
Yeah, it's like the energy and intention behind the movement.
She also talked about how some Chinese dance techniques use a preparatory downward movement before an upward action, which is similar to the idea of grounding and gathering energy in hip-hop.
So there are these interesting parallels, even if the overall aesthetic is quite different.
Right. But she did say that adjusting to the primary direction of movement was a big challenge.
Because Chinese dance often emphasizes upward movements, while hip-hop is generally more downward focused.
Exactly. And she even had this funny anecdote about being told she was too Chinese dance in a Suai class in Shanghai.
What happened?
Well, she wasn't using enough chest movement, which is very characteristic of many street dance styles.
So her background was actually working against her in this case.
Yeah, in a way. But it's also a reminder that each dance style has its own unique vocabulary and aesthetic, and it takes time and practice to truly embody those nuances.
And that experience probably helped her to start defining her own personal style within street dance.
Absolutely. And it's clear that she has a deep appreciation for a wide range of styles. She mentioned popping, hip-hop, crump, whacking, afro, basically the whole spectrum of street dance.
Which is fantastic. It shows a real openness and curiosity. But she also mentioned the potential danger of becoming a for-nothings.
Yeah.
Someone who dabbles in many styles but doesn't really achieve mastery in any. And I think that's a valid concern, especially today when there are so many options available and it's easy to get pulled in different directions.
Totally. Finding that balance between breadth and depth is key.
She also shared this experience from a beginner African dance class, where her natural tendency toward more controlled lyrical movements was really apparent. It's interesting how our existing movement habits can influence how we approach a new style.
It shows that we all come to dance with our own unique physicality and movement history.
And she stressed the importance of pushing past that initial awkwardness and discomfort when you're trying something new, because that's where the real growth happens.
Yes. Getting out of your comfort zone is so important, both in dance and in life.
So how did she approach learning multiple styles simultaneously? Because that can be a lot to juggle.
Right, and she pointed out that dancers have different opinions on this. Some find it confusing to jump between styles, while others find that the contrast helps them define their preferences.
I can see both sides. If you're really focused on mastering one style, too much variety might be distracting. But if you're still exploring, it can be helpful to try different things and see what clicks.
Exactly, and Charlene, well, during that intensive period in Shanghai, she often took a variety of classes in a single day without necessarily planning it that way.
So she was just going with the flow, seeing what was available.
Yeah, and her focus was on putting in the effort and consciously trying to switch between the demands of each style.
Which is not easy. It's like switching between different languages in your head.
Exactly. And initially, she experienced that blending of styles, like a bit of hip-hop creeping into her jazz movements, or vice versa. But over time, she developed a clearer separation and understanding of the unique qualities of each style.
It's like training your body and mind to adapt to different movement vocabularies.
And she realized that some styles might simply be less naturally suited to her body type or personal inclinations.
Like?
She mentioned feeling a certain stiffness that made the fluidity of jazz more challenging for her compared to the more grounded movements of hip-hop.
So it's important to be self-aware and recognize what works best for you. You don't have to be good at every style to be a good dancer.
Exactly. Which leads to another interesting question they discussed. How do you define proficiency in a dance style?
It's kind of a subjective thing, right?
Totally. And Charlene pointed out that it's tough to set a definitive benchmark because there's a natural progression from beginner to advanced to maybe even teaching levels.
And what one person considers good enough might be very different from another person's standard.
Right. But her advice was to focus on learning based on interest without getting too caught up in rigid rules or expectations.
I love that. It's about the joy of the process, not just achieving some arbitrary level of skill.
Exactly. And then they talked about the benefits of long-term mentorship with a specific teacher versus sampling classes from different instructors.
Which is a dilemma for a lot of dancers, especially in a city like New York where there are so many options.
Right. And Charlene initially embraced that sampler approach when she first got to NYC. It's natural to want to try everything and see what's out there.
It's like a buffet of dance styles.
But she eventually recognized the value of consistently taking classes with a particular teacher because it allows for a much deeper immersion into their style and their teaching methods.
It's like choosing a mentor rather than just collecting information from different sources.
And she compared it to adapting to different teaching styles in an academic setting. Once you understand a particular instructor's methods, you can learn much more effectively.
That makes so much sense. But she also pointed out the challenge of finding that consistent mentorship in NYC because popular teachers often become less available as their careers grow.
It's the downside of being in such a vibrant and competitive dance scene. But let's shift gears now and talk about Charlene's journey into teaching dance.
Because that's a whole other skill set, right?
Absolutely. And she initially hesitated to teach because she didn't see herself as a take-charge kind of person.
Which is interesting because you might assume that someone who's passionate about dance would naturally want to share that passion with others.
You would think so.
Ah,
But teaching requires a different kind of confidence and leadership. And it sounds like Charlene's early teaching experiences were pretty informal, helping friends with choreography for school performances and teaching them K-pop routines.
it's a good way to start in a low-pressure environment.
And those experiences were crucial for building her confidence. Having to break down dance concepts into simple terms for beginners forced her to really solidify her own understanding.
I can see how that would be helpful. It's like you learn the material even better when you have to teach it to someone else.
Totally. And from there, she progressed to her first formal teaching opportunities in studios in Shanghai, mainly focusing on K-pop. And then back in the U.S., she continued to build her experience, eventually teaching larger classes in NYC studios and even offering her own independent classes.
Wow, that's a really impressive trajectory.
It shows a real commitment to the craft of teaching. And she talked about how valuable the whole experience has been, not only for her teaching skills, but also for her own understanding of dance technique.
It's that feedback loop we were talking about earlier. Teaching helps you learn.
Exactly. So why the initial focus on teaching K-pop? She mentioned that it was partly due to trust and recognition of her skill in that particular style.
Makes sense. And she also made a really interesting point about the focus of many K-pop classes. She said that a lot of students are primarily interested in learning the choreography to specific songs, often with the goal of recording and sharing videos, which is fine, but it can sometimes mean that there's less emphasis on deep technical instruction.
Right, because the priority is on learning the steps, not necessarily the underlying technique.
Which brings up the whole issue of student engagement and how a teacher finds fulfillment in that kind of environment. And it seems like Charlene has a pretty pragmatic approach.
Yeah, she seems to recognize that students come to dance class with different motivations and levels of dedication.
Some are super serious about it, while others are just there for fun or exercise.
Exactly. And she avoids burnout by focusing on delivering her best instruction to every student without trying to force her own level of enthusiasm on everyone.
That's a great attitude. You can't make someone love dance, but you can create a positive and supportive learning environment.
And that leads us to the bigger picture.
Yeah.
Dance is a profession.
Right. And Charlene was very honest about the financial struggles that many dancers face.
Yeah, it's a notoriously difficult field to make a sustainable living in.
And for her, at least for now, she's choosing to keep dance as a passionate pursuit rather than her main source of income.
Which is a very valid choice.
She doesn't want to risk losing her love for dance by turning it into a grind. And she observed that a lot of dancers end up having to teach a ton of classes just to make ends meet.
Which can be exhausting and leave less time for your own training and creative exploration.
So there's a real trade-off there. But even with those realistic concerns about the professional dance world, Charlene recognizes the mutual benefits between teaching and her own development as a dancer.
It goes back to that feedback loop, right?
Yeah.
Teaching forces you to articulate your knowledge, which deepens your own understanding.
And teaching those technical foundation classes keeps her motivated to stay on top of her own training in those areas. It's a win-win.
I agree. So let's talk about choreography.
Okay, because that's a whole other creative realm within dance. And she mentioned that for her beginner classes, she tends to focus on routines that incorporate foundational elements rather than overly complex choreography.
It's smart. It allows beginners to develop a solid base before moving on to more challenging material.
And she talked about her early experiences with weekly choreography demands, which really forced her to develop discipline and creative problem-solving skills.
Right. It's one thing to learn and perform existing choreography, but a whole other challenge to consistently create new material.
Especially when you hit those creative blocks.
Oh, absolutely. And she mentioned some strategies for overcoming those blocks, changing the music she's working with or actively seeking inspiration from other teachers and choreographers.
So stepping outside of her own headspace.
Exactly. And it sounds like her current choreography process is very intuitive.
How so?
She starts by immersing herself in the music, then improvises and explores movements that feel right.
It's a beautiful blend of planning and spontaneity. Now, what about those inevitable plateaus that everyone hits in their learning journey, and how to stay motivated over the long haul?
Right, and Charlene's honest about that. She said that her periods of low motivation often coincide with external life stressors.
Which is so relatable. When you're dealing with other stuff, it can be hard to stay focused on your passions.
But she's found that dance itself can actually be a source of release and healing during those times. The physicality of it can be therapeutic.
It's a way to process emotions and work through stress.
And her strategy for getting back on track when she's feeling unmotivated is to focus on the aspects of dance that she truly enjoys and allow herself to have periods of less intense training.
It's about listening to your body and your mind.
And respecting your own needs. Okay, let's touch on injuries, which unfortunately are a common reality for dancers.
Right. It's a physically demanding art form.
And Charlene's had her own share of minor injuries, dealing with things like wrist strains and back issues. It's a good reminder that even with proper technique, there's always a risk.
Yeah.
And she admitted to sometimes pushing through pain and dancing when she probably should have been resting.
I think a lot of dancers can relate to that. It's hard to stop when you're passionate about something.
But she also stressed the importance of listening to your body's signals and taking breaks when you need them.
Because ultimately you can't dance if you're injured.
Exactly. So, shifting gears a bit, she talked about the late-night culture that's so prevalent in many dance communities.
Yeah, those late-night practice sessions, parties, and ciphers, it's a whole subculture.
And she mentioned the challenge of maintaining healthy eating habits when your schedule is so unconventional.
It's tough to eat a balanced meal at 2 a.m. after a dance session.
Right. It requires some planning and discipline. Okay, there's this really interesting point that Charlene raised about the stereotype of Asian individuals lacking creativity in dance.
Oh, yeah, and she connected that to more rigid educational systems. It's like creativity is sometimes stifled by too much structure.
It's a really thought-provoking observation, and she wondered if her own experiences might have initially held her back creatively.
But the good news is that she's recently experienced a real growth in her own choreographic confidence.
It shows that creativity is a skill you can develop.
And she talked about the contrast between more prescriptive teaching methods, where you're told exactly what to do, and the emphasis on personal expression and freestyle.
It's a different mindset.
And she initially struggled to understand and embody feeling in her movement because she was so used to following explicit instructions.
Which makes sense. It takes time to unlearn those habits and embrace a more intuitive approach.
So, how did she cultivate that sense of creativity? It sounds like it was a gradual process of observing other dancers.
Seeing how they interpret music and movement in their own unique ways broadened her perspective.
It's like expanding your creative vocabulary.
And it was an iterative process of learning new ideas and techniques in class, then experimenting with them in her own movement, gradually shifting from a more prepared approach to a more spontaneous freestyle.
Which is a natural progression. It's like learning a language. You start with the basics, then you build fluency and eventually find your own voice.
And she used that analogy comparing it to language acquisition.
Love that.
Ah,
Okay, let's talk about dance parties and ciphers, which can be intimidating for a lot of dancers, especially those who are more comfortable with choreography.
absolutely. And Charlene was very honest about her initial discomfort with freestyling in front of other people.
Because it feels so vulnerable.
Right. It's like putting your raw, unedited self out there.
Mm.
And she talked about that fear of judgment, which I think a lot of people can relate to, not just in dance.
But she gradually became more comfortable, starting in smaller, more supportive ciphers with friends.
Which is a great way to ease into it.
But she still feels some unease in those larger, more intense party settings.
It's not her natural environment.
Right. And she sometimes feels disconnected from that just let loose and enjoy yourself vibe.
It's a different energy.
But despite that, she's been encouraged by other freestyle dancers who view going to parties as essential for understanding the culture and developing as a dancer. So it creates this internal conflict for her.
I can see that. It's like the pressure to conform to a certain expectation,
Yeah.
even if it doesn't feel completely authentic to you.
And her advice was to gradually ease into party settings if desired, maybe starting with friends.
But she also emphasized that it's perfectly okay if those environments just don't resonate with you. Your dance journey is your own.
Absolutely. Now, I'm curious about her observations about the differences between dance communities in New York City versus China and San Diego, starting with the teaching side of things.
She noted that teaching in NYC studios often offers less autonomy compared to teaching independently.
Meaning?
Well, there's usually a set curriculum or structure that you have to follow.
Right, and communication with students might be more limited in those larger studio settings.
Exactly. But in terms of community feel, she found a lot of similarities across all three locations. Those friendships and shared experiences, like taking classes and practicing together, seem to be a universal part of dance culture.
That's really nice to hear. But she did perceive a difference in emphasis and values.
In what way?
She felt that in NYC, there's a greater focus on individual expression and a certain rawness in movement, whereas in some of her experiences in China, the emphasis was more on technical precision and physical execution.
That's interesting. It's almost like a difference in aesthetic preference.
Exactly. And she specifically mentioned a greater appreciation for rawness over purely polished technique in NYC.
Which might reflect a greater value placed on individual style and authentic expression.
She also talked about the subjectivity of judging dance and how she didn't always understand why certain dancers were highlighted by teachers.
Goes back to what we were saying earlier about how different teachers have different preferences and criteria.
Yeah.
What one teacher sees as exceptional, another might not.
And she wisely pointed out that being picked out or not picked out in class isn't necessarily a definitive judgment of your skill.
It's just one person's opinion.
And she even used those moments of not being chosen as motivation to improve. Now, this is a funny little anecdote, but it highlights a cultural difference.
Tell me more.
She mentioned the practice of reserving spots in dance classes with water bottles in China, which she hadn't seen in the U.S.
That's interesting. It suggests a more structured and maybe even competitive approach to class.
And she also talked about the potential for cliques forming and complaints about reserved spots in China.
Which contrasts with the more individualistic and less territorial approach she observed in U.S. classes.
Exactly. It's like a different social dynamic.
And while the favorite student phenomenon might be more pronounced in smaller, longer-term classes in China, it's probably still present to some extent in the U.S.
I mean, it's natural for teachers to connect with students who are engaged and making progress.
Definitely. So this whole conversation about Charlene's experiences got me thinking about how our understanding of dance and art in general evolves over time.
How so?
Well, Charlene described a shift in her own appreciation, from valuing primarily technical skill to recognizing the importance of individual expression and that unique flavor that a dancer brings to their movement.
It's like appreciating the artistry beyond the technique.
And she realized that while technique can be learned, that personal essence is more distinctive and ultimately more valuable.
It's what makes a dancer truly memorable. And she's even used those instances where she didn't understand a teacher's choices as fuel for her own growth.
That's a great mindset, turning confusion into motivation. But what do you think it means to be on point in dance, to have that quality that makes a dancer stand out?
I think it's about finding that sweet spot between energy and control. Like you're fully embodying the music and the movement without being over the top or holding back.
That just right quality.
Exactly. And from what Charlene said, it seems like a lot of teachers in New York really emphasize that balance.
Which makes sense.
Yeah.
Because it's that subtle nuance that separates good dancers from great ones.
Now, I want to touch on something that I think is really important, but maybe a little harder to define. The deeper aspects of dance, the stuff that goes beyond technique and aesthetics.
Right. It's like the soul of dance.
And Charlene hinted at this when she talked about how your personality and inner thoughts can be reflected in your movement. It's that Wu Ru Ki Ren concept.
Which basically means that your movement reveals who you are.